everybody. How are you guys doing? Thank you so much, Dominic, for having me. Pleasure to be here. I always appreciate when people have nice things to say about us. It's better than the alternative. So I'm going to warn everybody who's on the call in advance. This is going to be a big topic, and we're going to hit it at a pretty high level. And I'm not going to leave you with a ton of tips and tricks, but what I'm going to leave you with is a little bit of more knowledge about like what the challenges that you guys face trying to do Agile as project managers, or especially project managers in the government space. I would imagine we do a little bit of government work, do a little bit with some defense contractors, and we've worked with the government specifically. So have a little bit of perspective of some of the challenges that you guys deal with. But before I get too deep into this, one of the things that I thought I would share with you is just a little bit about my history. So, been in and around IT for about almost 32 years or something like that. Started off my career in IT infrastructure, and I would say that kind of largely defined my the early part of my career. Let's say the first 8 years or so, maybe 10 years or so, and really did like servers and infrastructure and things like that. And then towards the end of that, got into infrastructure project management, and was doing that here in Atlanta. That's where I'm based out of, for a check printer and a consultancy and a bunch of different things. And then ended up moving into the financial services industry squarely and started doing like B2B, B2C software project management. So I got really introduced into, obviously like a lot of us who did a lot of ad hoc project management back in the day. That's probably about maybe 15, almost 20 years ago is when I first got my PMP, and learned a lot about, just standard, PMBOK kinds of stuff, waterfall kinds of methodologies. Started getting introduced in those stages to RUP. Had some crazy contractor that I worked with for a little bit who was trying to introduce me to extreme programming and pair programming and all kinds of different things. And so that was kind of like some early introduction to Agile. But what I was finding is that kind of my worldview was very Agile. Even within waterfall and within RUP, I really had kind of an inspect and adapt mentality. I didn't know that some of the things I wanted to do were kind of Agile until a bit later. And so at one point, towards the end of that experience, I was working for a company here in Atlanta called CheckFree. They got acquired by Fiserv, but they did online banking and bill payment stuff. And I had the benefit of working with a gentleman who is now in leading Agile, a guy named Brian Sondergaard, who introduced me to XP, Extreme Programming, which is one of the Agile methodologies that were popular at the time. This is probably in the early 2000s, like around 2003, 2004. And I was in the PMO trying to rationalize really how all of this extreme programming and Scrum stuff kind of made sense within this large ecosystem of software development that we were doing, because we were doing really large complex systems with COBOL mainframe backends and big reporting engines and service buses that were reaching out to other distributed systems and just front end systems and all kinds of stuff. And it was really, really complex. And at the time, Agile, really, this is again in the early 2000s, the only books that were out were really about small team Agile. And so what we were doing during that time is we were applying concepts from small team Agile and trying to really figure out, we didn't really have this word at the time, but we were trying to figure out was how do you do Agile program and portfolio management and actually be able to deliver large, not even just large projects, but large programs and collections of programs reliably and predictably across the entire organization. So we were doing some really interesting things. We were borrowing out of XP and Scrum in the early days, and we were borrowing out of David Anderson's work in Kanban before he even defined Kanban as a methodology. We were leveraging Mary Poppendick's work on Lean. Dean Leffingwell had not yet written the first book on SAFe. While we were doing that, he came out with Agile Software Requirements, which was kind of the proto book on SAFe. Scaling Software Agility is what it was called. Agile Software Requirements was kind of the second rev of that. And so we were, and when he wrote that book, I'm kind of like, oh wow, this is the book I wish I would have written, that kind of a thing. And so it was interesting, right? RUP was really big. People were still writing about RUP in the marketplace. And so we were bringing all these ideas together and trying to figure out how to be able to report out to our traditional PMO what it was that we were trying to do, and how we were delivering against projects. Because even though Agile is all about inspect and adapt, what we were struggling with was, how do you make commitments when you're in effect dealing with fixed time, fixed costs, and fixed scope? And so that was the world we were living in. And so we were trying to figure out how to make Agile work within that larger ecosystem. And we did some really interesting things, and I'm going to allude to some of them as the talk progresses. But what we really had to get really clear on is, what were the teaming strategies at the execution level, right? How were we doing work intake at the portfolio level? How were we systematically breaking down that work and getting user stories out to the team? Because we had these big things that needed to move through the portfolio. And then we had work decomposition that had to happen in an emergent way. And, we had scope and change control and all this different kinds of stuff. And there was just nothing in the Agile literature. I would say at the time specifically, we're giving kind of a nod to it now a little bit, but even some of the stuff that we're working on and some of the problems we're trying to solve in clients aren't, I believe, fully addressed in the literature, because everybody's thinking, you have to be this fully emergent, make it up as you go kind of a thing. And what we were trying to do is trying to really balance agility and discipline. And so we were doing some really interesting things, and it was a lot of fun, and learned a lot. And I've even said to this day, this is, almost 12, 13 years later, that a lot of the problems that we're trying to solve in market trace back to those early days at CheckFree, when we were trying to solve this problem in the financial services industry. And so the failure mode is really kind of a very repeatable common pattern. That became really clear to me when I left CheckFree and went to go work for Version 1. Version 1 got acquired recently, I think, by CloudNet. I think they're totally something else now. But I was working for those guys for a while, and going in and doing software setup for them, and also doing some basic Agile bootcamp kinds of things. And what got really clear to me during that time was that most of the organizations that we were selling software to and were trying to adopt Agile weren't really built for agility. And by that, I mean, they were in functional silos. They had traditional PMOs. They had traditional governance structures. They had traditional metric structures. And what we had was a lot of people that were running around trying to do Agile things, right? Do Scrum, or do XP, or, maybe it's like do Safe, right? Do the methodology, do the practices, try to apply the principles. But they were doing it within organizational constructs that were very orthogonal to how Agile was fundamentally designed. And so I started doing a lot of writing when I worked for Version 1. That's when I really started blogging and getting out and speaking and doing presentations and things like that. And what I was doing largely was kind of testing ideas in market and going, look, guys, this doesn't make sense what we're doing. And so I went back into the early writing, reread a lot of the things that I read when I was at CheckFree, and I was reading some of the newer stuff, Mike Cohn's Agile Estimating and Planning. Still is kind of the de facto work, I think, on how to structure and plan organizations. The scaling stuff was starting to come out. The early less books were out. I think Schwaber wrote a book on scaling Scrum. Jeff Sutherland was writing things, right? Lots of people were writing stuff on trying to do scale. Dean, I think by that point, had come out with his second book, and SAFe started being a thing. And what kind of my hypothesis is that all of these methodologies that are in market today, and all these methodologies that you guys are trying to use, are wholly predicated on the idea that you can form complete cross-functional teams, right? That those teams can operate off of a really clear, well-articulated backlog, and that the organization can produce a working, tested increment of software on regular intervals. And so I started getting out in market, and I did this talk called The Three Things at a Scrum gathering in Vegas, probably 7 or 8 years ago. Dan Magulo invited me to do that. and really was sitting in a room full of about 500 Scrum enthusiasts and asking like, okay, how many people out there can form a complete cross-functional team of 6 to 8 people and give them total autonomy over their technology stack, really effectively have no dependencies between them and the rest of the organization? How many product owners are building a backlog that meet the invest criteria? How many people are doing agile estimating and planning the way Mike Cohn taught us to? And how many people can actually produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint? And literally like 3 hands in the whole room raised up. And that was a really interesting moment for me, because what it told me is that the world had fully adopted Scrum as a way of working, but had totally lost sight of what was actually required within an organization to actually make it work. And the things, if you go back to the early writings, Alistair Coburn's writings, and I'm thinking like Jim Highsmith and the DSDM early stuff, all of it just assumed that you had the ability to form a cross-functional team, right? This group of 6 to 8 people where everybody can do everything. You have an on-site customer, a product owner in Scrum, and you can actually produce something that gets to a definition of done at the end of the sprint. And, we started going into organizations, and you just realize that just didn't exist, right? And so here's the problem that I think is facing you guys. You guys are project managers in organizations that run this way. And so when you try to do Agile and you say, okay, I'm going to go to Scrum training, or I'm going to go to SAFe training, and you come back and you try to apply those things, you're often applying them into an organization where that methodology doesn't really fundamentally fit. And so the challenge is that, like, when you look at, and it's been fascinating watching PMI get into the Agile space. Just kind of a fun fact about me, me and Jesse Fuel, you guys probably know him, he lives up in the DC area. Me and Jesse flew up to Philadelphia and met with PMI guys and really kind of pitched them on the whole idea of certification and building an Agile community of practice. They really, to their credit, picked up the ball and ran with it. And we were part of the first team that built the original PMI ACP certification. Alistair Coburn was on that with us. Dennis Stevens was on it with us. Jim Cundiff was on it. Some of those guys work with me in Leading Agile now. And so we went and we talked about this idea of getting PMI to adopt Agile. Well, so one of the challenges, and they're starting to address it with the acquisition of, Al Shalloway's Flex stuff and Scott Ambler's Disciplined Agile Delivery stuff. But one of the things that we were struggling with at the time is, how do you build a methodology or a certification around a methodology when there's so much of what's required that isn't within the purview of the project manager? And so, like, when it comes to the PMBOK, you guys can take the PMBOK and you can look at all the process areas. And I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I've opened up a PMBOK, but like the process areas, process groups, right? That kind of knowledge areas, process areas, that kind of a thing. And you can apply those situationally, no matter really what the organization is, because it's really just good project management. The problem that you have with Agile is that if the organization isn't built for Agile, like it's not structured in a way that really makes Agile work, applying the practices of Agile often sometimes actually gets you in trouble a little bit. And so what you see in practice, how that manifests itself, is in the need to wrap Agile stuff with project management stuff. And so that's what you see in practice a lot, right? We see people doing Scrum kind of at the work surface level, but then they're doing traditional project management across those work groups, right? Or whatever, teams. And so the problem with that, right, is that you're not really fully Agile, but you're not really fully plan driven either. And so most organizations that go down this path end up with really both sides of that suboptimized. I'd almost rather see an organization do really, really good, solid PMI style, PMBOK style project management and be really good at that, than do this kind of hybrid, because in order to do Agile right, we have to have the right kind of ecosystem. And so that's the problem that I think you guys are facing. And so where I'm taking this talk with you guys isn't so much around like, how do I do Agile? There's tons and tons of literature around how to do Agile. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is what is the nature of the things that you need to transform, and how do you go about transforming them? Now, again, I know my audience here. If I'm you at the end of this talk, I'm listening and I'm going, yeah, but Mike, I can't do any of that. So tell me what I can actually go do. Dave Pryor and I, we're actually recording a podcast later on today. And Dave's awesome. He's on my team and he's our CST. And so he is on the front lines doing Scrum training out in the marketplace with project managers. And he's constantly going, but Mike, like, how do I make this work when I can't get all these conditions right? And so I just want you to know, I have a lot of empathy for how you're going to receive my message here, but I'm just going to like talk with you guys about some of the challenges that you're going to experience in market, right? And so with that, I'm going to get through my preamble here, and I'm going to start talking a little bit about what executives want out of Agile, right? What they want out of an Agile transformation. And then talk a little bit about the things, if you're going through an Agile transformation, that I think that you need to consider, okay? And so normally, like, there's probably 3 contexts I give this talk in. And a lot of times I'll use this variants of this talk, even like in a situation where leading Agile is trying to sell a consulting engagement to an executive team. That's kind of where a lot of these ideas often come out of, because we are often selling into the C-suite and trying to get people to buy our services. And so what we're really trying to do is to talk with them about what's necessary and how we can help. But then also what we're trying to do is more broadly with this program we have within Leading Agile called Elevate Agile, is educate the market on how to help organizations really, really solve business problems with this, right? How to think about the problem the right way. And then kind of third, when I'm talking to people that are doing the work or managing the work, if they're struggling, hopefully at least help you guys understand like why. Right. And maybe give you some ground cover and recognize that you're not crazy. It's not your fault. It's not that you can't make it work. It's not that you need another certification class. It's just that the world is not in alignment with what you're trying to do. And what we've decided to do is to approach the market in a way where it's like, I don't want to train somebody to do Agile if they can't fundamentally be successful when they go back. So our practice is a lot about like, how do you refactor enterprises in order to be able to actually exploit these methodologies and get the business benefit from it. So if you can kind of like think in that frame, a lot of what I'm talking to is I'm talking to the senior leaders in organizations that need to understand that when they say, we want you guys to do Agile project management, what's really involved in that? How do we get there? And so when I start this conversation, the first thing that I do is I ask them, as I say, what is the value that you want out of your transformation? And so nobody wants to do Agile for the sake of doing Agile, right? Just showing up and doing Scrum or showing up and doing XP or showing up and doing SAFe is never, ever the point. Usually what executives want is greater predictability. They want to be able to make and meet commitments. They want to be able to put products in market and sell them or make use of them faster. They want to deliver with higher quality, right? They want to deliver with lower costs. They want to be more innovative. They want to make sure that they're building products that their customers will actually use. Sometimes what they're looking for is greater strategic alignment, making sure that the execution level stuff is actually mapping up to the strategic objectives of the organization. And so understanding the value of what you're doing in the transformation is really key. Okay. And so anchoring on that value is important. And so as project managers, right, it's not just about doing an Agile project, but it's asking yourself, are the things that we're doing leading to greater predictability? Are they leading to early delivery? Are they leading to cost savings, right? Because that's what Agile is all about. It's the only reason to do it. And so if you're going through the motions of Scrum or SAFe or whatever, and you're not actually generating that business value, you might as well be doing waterfall, right? But I'm not saying go do that, right? I'm saying like be aware of the things that you have to take into consideration so that you can actually deliver the value. And I have a couple computers going on here, so I apologize. Let's see if we can do this again. My apologies. I clearly don't know how to work a computer here. Let's do next. Okay, let's go back. Okay, cool. So the next thing is that when we're doing an Agile transformation, or when we've decided to implement Agile within a program, we want to make sure that we can measure progress of that transformation, right? We want to make sure that we know that we've been able to form teams that we can get value to flow across multiple teams. We want to make sure that we can align programs and portfolios to strategic value, right? And so if we're doing waterfall and we're going through a transformation, we want to be able to, as we're investing in training and coaching and things like that, we want to be able to show measurable progress. We want the organization to see that the things that we're doing and the dollars that we're spending are aligning with the organizational value prop. And then last but not least, and this is the key, is we want measurable results, right? So if we're going for greater predictability, we need to be able to decide and agree how we're going to measure and make sure that we are delivering in a predictable way. We're going to measure and make sure that we're able to put things in market faster. We're going to measure and make sure that we're able to deliver with greater quality, or that we're able to lower costs. And so we need to have metrics around that. And so that kind of tends to be the thing that the people that are commissioning these Agile projects tend to care about. Are you aligned with the problem I'm trying to solve? Can you show me how you're going to get there? And can you prove you've done it? Right? And so for us, a transformation ends up being like a project unto itself. It's like a project to build the organization that is going to deliver the project, because the methodology and the organizational design have to be congruent with each other. And so why is it that so many people are doing Agile, but are really struggling to get those business benefits? And the reason why I started the place that I started is because one of the things that I would hear from people a lot, and this is funny, would really entertain me. I get these phone calls and they'd be like, we're doing Scrum really, really well, but like something's broken, right? And I'd be like, well, like, what do you mean? Like, how are you doing it well and it's not working? And what they would say to me is that, well, we have product owners and we have Scrum masters and we do sprint planning and we do daily stand-up meetings and we do burn down charts and we do reviews and we do retrospectives and we measure velocity and all these things that Scrum wants us to do. But we're not getting the business benefit from it, right? And so they're saying that we're doing Scrum and they know how to do Scrum, but they're not actually getting the business benefit, right? And so why does business agility fail? It's because we're doing the methodology without achieving the outcomes in market that we're trying to achieve. And so I started trying to figure out how to help people understand the story. And so basically, what we kind of learned was that developing like an Agile methodology or an Agile ecosystem wasn't really sufficient. And even over the last 20 years, what does it mean to have an Agile ecosystem is even changed, right? And so where we started the conversation 20 years ago with the signing of the manifesto back in 2001 is we just have to acknowledge that it was everything in that early writing was about teams. And so the only problem that the manifesto signers were trying to solve at the time was, how do I get this tiger team of 6 to 8 people delivering the most effective thing that they can possibly deliver? And what's kind of funny, right? In the early days when I was really on the ground, building my organization and coaching myself and out working with teams and things like that, I remember this one time I was working with this group of people and I said, and they were in this really kind of jacked up organizational design and trying to do everything really heavy waterfall. And I asked them, I said, so what do you do when the project's in trouble? And they basically said, we get everybody in a room and we work together and we put everything up on the walls and we collaborate constantly and we get the product people or the business people in the room with us and we just work until it's done. We drop everything else and we work until it's done. And I asked him, I said, well, if that works, why don't you just do that all the time? Right. And it was a really fascinating conversation, right? Well, it was a couple things, right? Because in order to do that one project and to pull it out of the ditch, they had to kind of drop everything else, right? When they were in that room, working as a collaborative team, like everybody kind of had to sub-optimize their discipline. Like the developers had to test, and the testers might have written some code, and the project manager was throwing in and doing some requirements analysis, and the requirements analysis people were doing some testing, and right, everybody was kind of working together because we were in crisis mode. But when everybody wasn't in crisis mode, they all went back to their cubes and wanted to work independently. That's really what it came down to. And so what was fascinating is the things that they did in order to solve a crisis problem were actually some of the things that they needed to do as kind of their standard operating procedure, right? So you get a team of 6 to 8 people. You see a theme here, right? Team of 6 to 8 people, an embedded customer, put everything up on the walls, create everything, make it visible. But you do it not in crisis mode, but you do it at a sustainable pace, like something that you could execute on forever. And that's kind of Agile in a nutshell. And that's kind of what the early manifesto signers were trying to accomplish. Instead of only doing these things that work when you're in crisis, let's do them as standard operating procedure and just take the drama out of it, right? Cool, okay? But then something happened, right? So it was like we said, okay, this way of working really is effective. So like something kind of happened in the market, right? Is that Scrum came along, right? Scrum's awesome, right? Love Scrum. And Scrum launched the CSM certification. And the CSM certification is a 2-day thing, and it basically teaches people how to do Scrum, right? So it teaches you like the mindset and the mechanics of Scrum. Empower the teams, be a servant leader, right? All that kind of stuff. And it basically said, this is how you plan on 2-week increments, and this is how you collaborate daily, and this is how you do reviews and retrospectives, and this is what a story is, and this is what definition of done looks like. And and if you were getting really brave, you could do release planning, and it was this thing, right? And it works, right? It works when you have that small team, that on-site customer, and you're all in the same room. And then what do? Right? We said, okay, this process works. So I'm going to apply this process in a context that it doesn't work in. And so we decided to do Scrum on top of a functionally siloed waterfall organization, right? And so we kept doing the daily stand-ups and the reviews and retrospectives and the sprint planning meetings and trying to do burn down and everything, but we weren't delivering kind of across. Lots of reasons for that, right? Dependencies in technology, dependencies between teams, requirements, dependencies, things that have to be coordinated across the enterprise. It's really hard to inspect and adapt and deliver continuously when there's 48 other things that all have to happen in unison with you, right? And so we're trying to do Scrum down here, and we're almost like trying to pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist. And that works great for the team, kind of, but it doesn't work great for the rest of the organization. So again, wrong computer. I got too many things going on here. So what started to come along was this idea of Agile at Scale, or the notional idea of enterprise agility. And so what, methodologies kind of started to emerge were things like large scale Scrum and scaled Agile framework. Nexus, I think, is the one out of the Scrum Alliance. Just a lot of different things people are talking about. You have Al Shalloway's Flex stuff that PMI owns now, and you have the Discipline Agile Delivery that PMI owns now. And so all of these are like stabs at trying to figure out how to deal with enterprise agility. And so, but we kind of repeated the same mistake. And so what we tried to do with enterprise agility was recognize that we had a collection of teams. We didn't have single teams. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to wrap a collection of teams that all have dependencies between them into like a mega planning, right, cadence, right? So you think of like the PI and the release trains and things like that in SAFe. And so what was going on is that we're trying to put this wrapper around multiple teams. And so you could almost think about it, right? If you're thinking about Scrum versus SAFe, Scrum assumes that we're encapsulating the team. What SAFe assumes is that we're encapsulating like a work group. And I want to say Dean started off with like saying that like up to 400 people. I think the current guidance is around 150 people. Kind of requires big room planning, right? So there's a lot of stuff that goes on with SAFE. Again, a lot of it really hard to do, especially kind of in a COVID world. And even still, you would find even in large, complicated organizations, government contractors, large financial services, automotive manufacturers, things like that, it's hard to even encapsulate the work stream, right? And so these things are difficult because at the end of the day, whether it be SAFE at the team or Scrum at the team level or SAFE at the enterprise level, it still requires some ability to say, here's my backlog, this is my delivery unit, what can I produce on a regular interval, right? So I call it teams, backlogs, working tests of software. And so I felt like we understood the problem, okay? We understood how to solve it. And what we didn't really understand was how do you get there? And that becomes the next part of the story, right? Is this idea that we coined called a system of transformation. Because here's the interesting thing, right? Regardless of whether we're doing team level agility, or regardless of whether we're doing agile at scale, we have to get from point A to B. I wrote a blog post on this probably 10 years ago now. And it was really interesting because there was a period of time where PMI was coming out and the writers on PMI.org site were coming out with like, is your organization a good fit for Agile? And it was like, if you have functional silos and if you have governance and if you have to make and meet commitments and you have to do all these things, you're not a good fit for Agile, right? And I was like, well, that's unfortunate because I think those organizations need Agile as much as anybody. But there was almost like this group of people that were saying, Agile won't work here because our organization isn't right for it. And then there were like people on the other side that were basically saying, Agile is great for everybody, regardless of, and just totally disregarding the organizational constraints. So there were some people that were saying, Agile can't work here because my organization's broke. And there are the other people saying, well, Agile will work everywhere, regardless of if your organization is broke. And I always found myself kind of in the middle. And I was like, okay, like what do we do now in order to be able to set the stage for agility? And then how do we actually orchestrate the transformation in this stepwise manner so that we can get to be the kind of organization? Because I didn't want to have a fixed mindset and say, we can't change, but I also didn't want to ignore the reality that the organization was incongruent with it. So if you had an organization that wanted to go towards greater business agility, like what would be the steps necessary? And so that's like way beyond the scope of what I can cover in the next 20 minutes or so. But the problem is that we had to help organizations figure out what the path was like. And so if you hit our website, we talk about things like expeditions and base camps and outcomes-based plans and different activities. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to create like a work breakdown structure for an enterprise transformation, and then use really solid program management techniques in a kind of rolling wave planning, progressive elaboration style to be able to say, okay, we're going to work on this part of the organization. We're going to get it this mature, and then we're going to get it that mature. And then we're going to start on the next one, and we're going to move it through this maturity process. And then constantly tying back to value, constantly being able to measure results, right? All that kind of stuff. And what we found is that in our practice is when we do that really, really well, not only are we able to change the organization, it's very well received. If you can't measure, you can't control, you can't do it in a predictable way, then it's really difficult to keep the organization's attention. So it's almost like you have a system of delivery that is like a plan for how you're going to deliver the product. And then you have a system of transformation that's the plan for how you're going to change the organization. And what's still fascinating though, right? And again, right, I deal mostly with non-governmental agencies, mostly commercial enterprises. And there's still largely, even with this level of understanding, the difference between team, the difference between enterprise, the idea that you have to transform and make it structured, we still found that a lot of the transformation work we were doing was largely within IT and disconnected from the business. And the reason why is because the business kind of gets to say, or your customer kind of gets to say, I don't care how you guys deliver your work. Just give me what I want when I want it. right? And unfortunately, that's the way that a lot of businesses and customers tend to interact. So you get large batch requirements over here on one side, and then you're trying to break those large batches into small batches and deliver them in an agile and incremental way, trying to figure out how to make trade-offs within constraints so that you can deliver most of the scope within the time and cost constraints that have been established for the program. But ideally, right, we need the business to care, right? We need the customers to care, and we need to help teach them how to exploit the agile delivery capacity that you guys are building. And in an ideal way, we would love to have the business come to us with smaller batches. We would love them to run tighter experiments, to be willing to put smaller things in market, or to get things tested and deployed as we go, right? I mean, that would be an ideal thing. So one of the things that we're trying to talk about with people is almost like assume that like these three circles exist. Just assume they're done for a moment. If we really wanted to talk about business agility, we're not talking about creating the agile delivery engine. What we're really talking about is how do I get the business to exploit that agile delivery capability? So if you can imagine, like what we have is in a well-functioning agile enterprise, and we've gone through the transformation, we should be able to have whole complete teams at the execution level working off clean backlogs, able to produce a working tested increment of software every 2 weeks. We should have requirements that flow across those teams, making sure that all the work that is being done at the team level is being delivered in small batches every 3, 4, or 5 weeks, maybe every 6 weeks at the program level. So you have like a program level batch. And then at the top, we have our portfolio tier where we want to have small projects that are aligned to strategy, right? That is an idealized enterprise transformation success, right? If you can get the portfolio to accept small batches, get them decomposed in a progressively elaborated rolling wave way, and that's feeding backlogs at the execution level down at the team. Okay, that's a win. Right? Even if the business is stiff-arming the delivery organization, that's what you want. So now, once you've built that enterprise delivery capability, what we want to do is we want to make an offer to the business, and we want to teach them how to exploit that capability. Okay. And in the exploiting of that capability, we want to teach the business, we want to get the business to feed the system in smaller batches. And we want the business to be able to receive feedback in tighter loops and make more dynamic decisions about what they're feeding the engine. Okay. And so true business agility. Somebody have a question? Somebody just went off mute. Okay, cool. So true business agility is not just about the delivery organization being able to do Scrum at the team level. It's not even about being able to do safe or less or disciplined agile delivery at the enterprise level. Transformation is really the way we got there. It's about teaching the business how to exploit the capability of the IT organization to deliver in smaller batches, get faster feedback, and then the ability to pivot. So there's a large auto manufacturer we're working with, and we're doing an initiative with them that they call PDO, which is Product Driven Organization. And that's what we've been working on with them for a long time is how to get the system of delivery in IT up to like that enterprise level. And we've been walking through this enterprise transformation. And what was really cool is that they were one of the organizations that had to flip parts of their organization from making cars to making ventilators. Right. And literally, we were able to get the organization to pivot very quickly to basically manufacturing something totally different. And they actually gave us a bit of credit for helping them be able to do that more dynamically and talking about how hard it would have been had they not had the ability to pivot within their IT and manufacturing organization. So that's pretty cool, right? But it took like a pandemic to kind of force the business into exploiting that capacity. What if we could get the business to exploit that capacity on a regular basis? And now agility really happens as the business looks at the market, not so much as the business looks at IT, right? And that's the possibility of where we're going. And then now we start to think through that, right? And then kind of the next phase is like, how do we do that business transformation, right? How do we progressively engage the business in the conversation, right? So neat, right? And so the third leg of this is really what we might call like organizational agility. And that's really the holy grail that we want to try to do, because here's the thing, right? If you're in a government agency and you're trying to drive greater business agility for your department, like it exists on two levels. You need to be able to intake work, right, in a way that is agile, right? So the work that comes into the organization, we need to be able to inspect and adapt. But what we're finding, right, is the world changes around us, is that the organization needs to be able to inspect and adapt too. Okay. And so if you think about it, right, we've got the ability of the organization to regroup around new capabilities that the market all of a sudden decides it needs. I see we've got a question. Is there a difference between deliver of software or hardware when it comes to an agile transformation? Yeah, way beyond the scope of what I can try to cover here, right? But the core of the difference comes in the fact that software is, even though it doesn't feel like it all the time, is at least in theory infinitely malleable, right? There's nothing physical that I have to deal with. As you start going into manufacturing, right, it starts to me to look a whole lot more like lean and systems engineering and things like that. I think manufacturing has kind of understood the idea of like just in time and small batches and things like that for a longer time. One of the interesting problems that we're trying to solve with a couple of our customers is when you have like a manufacturing line that's producing product and you have software that's going into that in an agile way as well. So yes, there is a difference. Yes, you need to think about it differently, but I would say that fundamentally the same kinds of principles apply. Okay. And so getting back into like how we're thinking about this and how I would like you guys to think about it, and then I'll put a little bow on it and hopefully I'll have a few minutes for questions, is that if you are working in an environment where you have 6 to 8 people, complete cross-functional teams, very few dependencies that can be very simply managed with like a scrum of scrums or something like that, then really like team level agility, Scrum, and XP is really kind of all you need. But the thing you have to pay attention to is if you have a lot of dependencies in Scrum, then it starts to break down, and it's going to break down, and dependencies are going to kill you, right? They're the number one impediment to adopting Agile, is when one team is connected to everything else, really difficult to inspect and adapt. Where people go is they say, well, I want to do SAFe, right? Or I want to do large scale Scrum. Well, large scale Scrum basically assumes that there's no dependencies. SAFe assumes that there are dependencies, but the dependencies are contained within the work group, the group of teams, right? And so the problem is that if that's not true, and that's not true in a lot of large complicated organizations, and it's not true in a lot of government contracting agencies, what do you do with dependencies between work groups? Right? And then you're faced with the question, do I want to manage dependencies or do I want to break dependencies? The more I manage dependencies, the less agile I'm going to be. The more I break dependencies, the more I'm looking at a transformation rather than just deploying a methodology, right? So that gets us into kind of the enterprise transformation. And then you'll have a set of concerns, right? Where is team level agility just enough? And maybe for you guys it is, right? Because if I'm running a program that has like a defined start, a defined finish, a defined team, like I might not be trying to change the capability of the organization to deliver dynamically. You might be content with those first 3 circles. Most of the companies that call us are actually trying to become an agile enterprise. And that is way more than just helping people with Scrum or SAFe. It involves a lot of business architecture, a lot of technology refactoring, a lot of encapsulation of organizational units, a lot of encapsulation of business capabilities and things like that. And so putting together a program to move them into this new dynamic world And then this, what I have on my screen is system of continuous improvement, is the ability to adapt that business architecture to the changing needs of the market. And that's where you get into the difference between like team level organization or enterprise level agility versus organizational agility. And so figuring out how to have different conversations, like team level agility is insufficient for organizational agility. Enterprise agility is insufficient for organizational agility. Organizational agility is really something of a different kind, but the team level and the enterprise stuff is kind of a precondition for it. You might think of it that way. Last thing is I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of the model and practice. And so one of the things that we think about a lot, right, because we have to run really structured, disciplined transformations. And so we kind of coined the idea of a system of transformation. We talk about something in the organizations we work with called an Agile Transformation Office. It's kind of like a PMO for the Agile transformation. But it's like, so it's a little bit like, a lot of times PMOs can be all over the place. Like I've seen PMOs where it's really like the collection of project managers, and I've seen PMOs where it's like they're the people that govern how project management happens, right? So this is a little bit of a hybrid, right? So an Agile Transformation Office governs how we're going to orchestrate the transformation, how we're going to do the work breakdown structure organizationally. What are the common services that need to happen within to facilitate the transformation? And then what teams do we need to bring to bear? What consultancies do we need to bring to bear? What staff do we need to bring to bear? And so the system of transformation is like the PMO for the transformation. And it provides the services that operate on the business to be able to move it through the steps that are necessary. And then we'd like to distinguish that between the system of delivery, which is, okay, in an early stage transformation where I have lots of dependencies and I want to try to do Agile, what am I going to do on day one to unlock myself? And then how do I move? Like, so system of delivery can be something heavy day one. One of the things I tell organizations quite a bit is that sometimes in a really heavily dependency-oriented organization, SAFe is actually insufficient. As much crap as SAFe gets in the market for being heavy, sometimes it's not heavy enough. And you need more dependency management and more upfront planning. But as you start to break dependencies and realign the organization, you might have various systems of delivery along the way that basically start to deprecate some compensating controls as you start to allow teams to operate more autonomously, right? And so then the third leg of it is really this idea of system of continuous improvement, which is how are we going to continue to inspect and adapt on the organization itself and respond to the changing needs of the market by adapting the business architecture and deploying new capabilities and making sure that skills are continuously assessed and the organization is staying, is delivering as an entity, right? And adaptive as an entity. So we've started to carve out these three things: system of transformation, system of delivery, system of continuous improvement. And then at some point, the organization gets tired of doing transformation and says, okay, we're done. So we end up in this situation where we really almost have like an in the business, on the business, where you have the system of delivery, which is the way the organization operates. And then you have the system of continuous improvements, which is largely like a remnant of the transformation office. It's probably where like the Agile PMO would end up going to basically to continuously improve the organization over time, right? And so again, right, take this for what it's worth. Your mileage may vary, but again, right, so if I'm sitting in the middle of a program, right, the things that I would want to know is what are the fundamentals of getting team level agility to work? How am I going to deal with dependencies in a really clear, concise way? And if that's all that you guys really fundamentally care about for your program, it's probably sufficient. If you happen to be responsible for orchestrating a transformation within the organization, right, what I would suggest is that the real work isn't teaching people how to do Agile. The real work is engaging the organization to break dependencies between teams and work groups. Because if you can get the dependencies broken between teams and work groups, all of the other Agile methodology stuff starts to snap to grid. Where we get creative with methodology is what do you do in the presence of dependencies, right? And so how do you maintain the spirit and the intent of Agile when the spirit of intent of Agile never really accounted for dependency management. Again, SAFe handles it within the work group, but doesn't really deal with it effectively, I think, across work groups. And then if you are doing like real transformation, you really are trying to drive business agility, then you got to think about, like, once I have that capability done, how do I engage the business? How do I transform the business to take advantage and exploit that capability? And then ultimately, how do I make sure that the organization stays in a business agile kind of state, right? So I think I managed, Dominic, to leave 5 minutes.
Excellent.
Okay, cool.
Fantastic presentation. Thanks,
Cool,
Mike. I personally have about a dozen questions, but
cool.
while other people are thinking about their questions, which they can feel free to put in the chat window, I do want to, a lot of people ask for copies of the presentation.
Cool.
Candace has agreed that I can put her email address in the chat window.
Cool.
Also, people can go to leadingagile.com, of course, and get a lot of information for the presentation itself and other information. I'll start with a question, and then we've got 4 or 5 minutes for other questions. So, in terms of measuring progress and measuring results, measuring progress, Scrum and burn down charts are pretty good. So measuring progress is kind of easy with Agile. Measuring results, that's a lot harder. Do you have any advice on kind of best practices there?
So I'll try to hit this, because I could probably spend 10 minutes trying to answer this one question, right? So typically when I talk about measuring progress, like one of the things that we often do when we're doing transformations, we start to measure activity. Things like, do I have Scrum Masters trained? Are the teams doing Agile, right? That kind of a thing. And so when I say measure progress, what I'm looking for are the performance characteristics of the organization, right? So can the team deliver with a stable velocity? Can the team make and meet a release commitment? Can the team inspect and adapt and meet commitments over a longer planning horizon? Right? Those are organizational attributes that matter, right? But they're like leading indicators of health. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to say, okay, is this ability to deliver more frequently in market actually tangibly giving us the ability to get feedback? And are we able to use that feedback to pivot to make sure that we're putting the right things in market? Or is it giving us the ability to lower costs? Or is it giving us the ability to innovate more effectively? Right? So I just distinguish between, like, what are the characteristics of an agile enterprise, and then what results is that agile enterprise delivering?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's really hard to tell if you're a for-profit company. It's really hard to track. This sales increase was directly related to this agile team delivering this feature. But I like the fact that there are proxies that are important to the business that you can reasonably assume translate to higher quality, higher sales, whatever.
Absolutely, right. So again, right, we learned this the hard way from being a consultancy, and try to literally, and I hope I don't come across salesy, but literally we've been building this consultancy for the last 10 years, and you start to learn, right, if you can't tell the organization, give them a leading indicator that the dollars they're spending are moving them, then you don't get to stay, right? And then if it doesn't demonstrate the results, you don't get to stay, but it just takes longer, right? And so this 1-2 punch of the leading indicator, lagging indicator, and you said it perfectly, it's a reasonable hypothesis that if we do these things and we achieve these performance characteristics, the results will follow. And then you got to measure the results too, right? You don't have an infinite amount of time to make sure that you deliver that.
Right.
Yeah. I hate to say this, you are at the top of your hour, man.
I have one last question. It's an easy one.
Okay.
Those are guitars in the background, right?
Yes.
So who's the greatest guitarist of all time, Mike?
Oh my gosh. I'm going to give a nod to Eddie Van Halen since he passed this week.
I respect that.
Yeah.
I respect that answer.
But that's like picking your kids, man. It's like there's so many great ones out there. So
there is indeed. I hate the fact that we've run out of time. A couple people are chiming in the chat window. Stevie Ray Vaughan Stevie Ray Vaughan is wrong. Jimi Hendrix is right. So we got one right answer. One wrong.
Yeah, Brian, they're all great. It's
Brian
like I would
May.
go like Nuno Betancourt. He's one of my favorites. Zach Wilde's an awesome, right? I mean, there's so many like exotic guitar players too. I mean, how do you pick, right?
Very true. Oh, one last thing.
Joe Bonamassa, yeah.
Joe, sure.
Yeah.
I hate the fact Eddie Van Halen, who's one of the youngest ones, passed away. That is so.
Yeah.
Like, and he had people have lived a much harder life and are still alive. That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
One last thing we always say to newcomers here, connect with all of us on LinkedIn. That's how we build the community. I look forward, a great presentation, Mike. We're going to need you to come back, that's for sure, in the future. I hope to see everybody else next month for November's Agile Wednesday webinar. Thanks everybody for joining, and thanks once again.